Representative Gates introduces War Powers Resolution to pull U.S. troops out of Syria. The House will be forced to vote on the resolution within 18 days of its introduction. Representative Matt Gaetz has introduced a War Powers Resolution that would order President Biden to pull all U.S. troops out of Syria, a move that came after 4 U.S. troops were reported injured in a raid against ISIS in the country. Congress has never authorized the use of military force in Syria. The U.S. is currently not in a war with or against Syria, so why are we conducting dangerous military operations there? President Biden, we must remove all U.S. armed forces from Syria. America first means actually putting the people of our country first, not the interests of the military-industrial complex, Gates said in a statement on the resolution. He said the purpose of the resolution was to see where Congress stands on the U.S. military presence in Syria. According to a press release from Gates' office, the War Powers Resolution is privileged, meaning the House will be forced to vote on it within 18 days of its introduction. The press release said he filed the resolution on Tuesday. Since the invasion of Ukraine, we seem to have turned our attention away from some of America's entanglement in Syria, and the purpose of my legislation is to force members of Congress to vote on record regarding whether they think we ought to continue this war in Syria. And here is, this is Aaron Mate on Jimmy Dore on the map.
Mate sitting in for Jimmy Dore here with Americans comedian Kurt Metzger and the miserable liberal Steph Zamorano. And here is some recent news from CENTCOM, that's the U.S. Central Command. ISIS senior leader killed and 4 U.S. service members wounded in helicopter raid in northeastern Syria. Because, oh yeah, guess what? We have a U.S. occupation force occupying 1/3 of Syria. We never talk about it, but it's happening. And here, 4 U.S. service members just got wounded in a raid. And the reason we don't talk about it is because our media pretty much never reports it, except for on this occasion. This is back in 2018. Look at the headline from the Washington Post. America's hidden war in Syria. U.S. troops will now stay in Syria indefinitely, controlling 1/3 of the country and facing peril on many fronts. That's 2018.
Oh, well, I'll give you guys that. What? Trump. That's the answer to the war in Syria.
So like this headline says, there is a hidden war in Syria, and it's hidden because our media pretty much refuses to cover it. And now the U.S. is occupying 1/3 of Syria. And that region, as you can hear about on shows like the Jimmy Dore Show and read about at the Gray Zone, that region of Syria happens to have Syria's most valuable wheat and oil resources, and that's why the U.S. is there.
You know, we're not keeping it and selling it. It's just to hurt them.
Exactly.
It's not. There's not enough oil. Like, they don't really sell their oil, I guess, right?
They sell it to fund their proxies, like the Kurds. But yes, the main goal is to hurt the rest of Syria, to keep it poor and divided, because Syria, as we'll talk about, was the site of a dirty war where the U.S. armed sectarian death squads, and the U.S. didn't win. They succeeded in leaving a lot of Syria in ruins, but they didn't overthrow the government.
You're welcome, Syria.
You're welcome, Syria. Now you get, as your reward, you get a U.S. military occupation stealing what it can from you.
And you should probably pay us a little bit for that. That's not cheap.
So here is now a new announcement from Congressmember Matt Gaetz. He's a Republican, and he says this: what are we trying to win in Syria? If Biden has a plan worthy of risking American lives, he should tell it to Congress. I haven't heard one. And he's saying that because he's introduced a measure to withdraw all U.S. forces from Syria. And once it gets introduced, there has to be a vote in the coming days. So this is his new initiative to get a U.S. withdrawal from Syria. And this is what Matt Gaetz says. He says the U.S. Constitution gives Congress the sole power to declare war. To date, Congress has never authorized kinetic participation of U.S. armed forces in Syria. Additionally, pursuant to Section 5C of the War Powers Resolution, Congressmember Gaetz' War Powers Resolution mandates the removal of U.S. armed forces from Syria no later than 15 days after the date of the resolution's adoption. So he wants a vote now to get U.S. troops out of Syria now. He goes on, Congress has never authorized the use of military force in Syria. The U.S. is currently not in a war with or against Syria. So why are we conducting dangerous military operations there? President Biden must remove all U.S. armed forces from Syria. America first means actually putting the people of our country first, not the interests of the military-industrial complex, said Gaetz. And he also added this. He said, mounting concerns continue to signal that President Biden himself does not have a cognitive grasp on the Syrian conflict. During an August 2021 interview with ABC News on U.S. involvement in the Syrian conflict, Biden stated, "We don't have military in Syria to make sure that we're going to be protected." At the time of the interview, the U.S. had an estimated 900 troops in Syria.
You know, Matt Gaetz is not in his prime.
Well, this is what Matt Gaetz is referring to. This is Biden back in August 2021.
How about the threat to the United States? Most intelligence analysis has predicted that al-Qaeda would come back 18 to 24 months after a withdrawal of American troops. Is that analysis now being revised? Could it be sooner?
It could be, but George, look, here's the deal. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they metastasize. There's a significantly greater threat to the United States from Syria. There's a significant greater threat from East Africa. There's significant greater.
Is that because we work with them in Syria? They're our pals now, man. Good guys. You see Rambo 3?
In fact, are glaringly obvious.
Get a knife.
We're going to hear Biden admit that later on, that the U.S. and its allies do work with al-Qaeda in Syria.
Threat to other places in the world than it is from the mountains of Afghanistan. And we have maintained the ability to have an over-the-horizon capability to take them out. We don't have a military in Syria to make sure that we're going to be protected.
And you're confident?
So he already said that we don't have a military in Syria to make sure that we're protected. Now, you can interpret that many ways. The way Matt Gaetz interpreted it is that that Biden doesn't seem to be aware that the U.S. has a military occupation inside Syria.
But is that just Biden lying?
Who knows what's going on in Biden?
He really is the perfect president.
We're going to have that in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I'm confident we're going to have the over-horizon capability, yes. The deal is the threat from al-Qaeda and their associate organizations is greater in other parts of the world to the United States than it is from Afghanistan.
All right, so keep that clip in mind, because we're going to hear Biden explain shortly why there is a threat from al-Qaeda in Syria, which he acknowledged accidentally a few years ago. Here's more from Josh Landis. He is a scholar at the University of Oklahoma, a specialist in Syria, and he's talking about Matt Gaetz's announcement of a resolution to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria. Landis quotes Gaetz, "If Joe Biden wants to keep U.S. troops in the Syrian conflict, he should have to explain to us what the goal is and what winning looks like. One of my greatest disappointments in the 118th Congress is that people who I thought were anti-war Democrats seem to be consumed, have been cheerleaders for our armed conflict," Gaetz said. That's Josh Landis quoting Matt Gaetz. And so why is the U.S. in Syria? Well, there's no better authority than U.S. officials themselves. So here is, first of all, Dana Stroul. She is now a senior Pentagon official responsible for the Middle East, including Syria. And back in 2019, when she was the head of a congressional study group, she explained why U.S. troops are in Syria.
The United States still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified four. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic.
Hear that? We own 1/3 of Syrian territory via the U.S. military. That's her acknowledging that. We own it because we're occupying it.
Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the U.S. military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria study groups.
Only about 1,000 troops. It's a light footprint for us. So, hey.
This is just a smug. She sounds like she went to the Victoria Newland School of Statecraft and Baking.
And ask yourselves, I mean, did anybody vote for this person to occupy 1/3? Did anybody in Syria vote for her to occupy their country and steal their oil?
She made Newland cookies.
Report and
unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington.
So hear that?
The
1/3
hydrocarbons.
The hydrocarbons. Why the 1/3 of Syria? It's the resource-rich portion of Syria that we own because we're occupying it. And she's almost salivating over it because these warmongers, they get meaning in life from occupying foreign countries and stealing their resources. And look how proud she is of this U.S. policy of owning another country's rich region where they have their oil and
the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
You know what this sounds like? You know, like with a stereotype lady at the office who runs like the Secret Santa, except it's some murders on abroad. Except it's just worldwide conflict. Like, she wants to say oil, but I guess she knows she can't say
hydrocarbons.
That's what that is, right?
Yeah,
they know it's not cool to keep saying oil.
Oil, yeah. You got to say hydrocarbons.
Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse.
Agricultural powerhouse. That means wheat. That means the ability for Syria to feed itself is being owned by the U.S. and stolen from them.
We argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned.
Again, we own it. We own it because we're there with our military.
Both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict.
So there we go. Owning that part of Syria gives us control of the resources, and that gives us leverage, like any good mafia don wants, to bully Syria into doing what it wants. In this case, overthrowing Bashar al-Assad. So that's Dana
It's not to bully Assad, it's to bully the people that live there into having revolution because we want it.
Exactly right.
Well, what's wrong with that?
So that's Dana Stroll in 2019. And you hear her laying out the actual reasons for the U.S. occupation of Syria, okay? Fast forward to 2021, when she announced the Biden administration is committed to keeping U.S. troops in Syria. And check out her new explanation for why U.S. troops are there. You're not going to hear her be as honest as she was back in 2019.
Your
now there's a new
inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
rationale for why the U.S. is in Syria.
Senator, first of all, one of the key recommendations of the Syria study group was that we should retain our U.S. military presence in northeast Syria, both because ISIS is not defeated, because we made commitments to the Syrian Democratic Forces.
You piece of shit. Well, she looks a lot better, though. Can I give her credit? She looks like she's been taking care of herself a little more.
So ISIS is not defeated, and we have to be there for our Kurdish partners, which means our proxies, the people we're using to weaken Syria. So now the rationale has changed. We have to be there to defeat ISIS.
Wow. You know, evil looks good on her. Victoria Nuland blows her right up being evil. This one, she's getting better.
That they continue to fight ISIS, but cannot do that without our support, training, and advice. And because there are tens of thousands of ISIS...
They need our support and training, our advice. The Kurds do. That's why we have to be there.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
Detainees still under SDF custody, as well as families of ISIS fighters at the Al-Hol IDP camp. We provide, through security cooperation authorities and funding, support and training so that there's a humane and humanitarian approach to the families and children while we facilitate relocation to the countries of origin of those foreign fighters and facilitate long-term solutions to the Syrian and Iraqi detainees. So first of all, for retaining U.S. military presence, the Biden administration is committed to retaining U.S. military presence in northeast Syria.
So you hear that? The rationale is now completely changed. In 2019, when she's the head of a congressional study group, she's openly acknowledging that we're there to steal their oil and their resources because that gives us leverage because we own 1/3 of Syria, and that means we can help dictate who gets to rule Syria. Now in 2021, she's back serving under Biden, and now it's, we have to help our partners and take care of the prisoners that are there and fight ISIS.
Wait, she said help the ISIS families?
Yeah, because there are detainees. There are, because the U.S. Helped ISIS spread inside Syria. And we're going to get to that. But basically, ISIS came into Syria from Iraq because of the Iraq.
When I go in.
That is what she's saying. But look, another person who admitted the actual reason why the U.S. was in Syria is not just Dana Stroul back in 2019. It's also this guy, Donald Trump, back when he kept U.S. troops in Syria. This is what he said.
We've secured the oil, and therefore a small number of U.S. troops will remain in the area where they have the oil. And we're going to be protecting it, and we'll be deciding what we're going to do with it in the future.
What now? Here's the difference between an idiot like Trump and a great woman like Stroul or whatever her name is. He didn't say hydrocarbon. That's why he's not fit to be president. He doesn't know how to say hydrocarbon.
We're there
it's
to
not
take
hard.
We're there to take the hydrocarbons. Doesn't have the ring to it. We're there to take the oil.
Steal the terrific hydrocarbons. And meanwhile, we're not doing that, right? Like, we're not selling their hydrocarbons. It's just to hurt them. We're not profiting from that.
But this is a good example of how U.S. officials are more honest than U.S. media stenographers. Because the New York Times, check out this recent article in the New York Times. This is how every time they talk about why the U.S. is in Syria, this is what they'll say. They won't
Your
quote
inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
actual U.S. officials like Dana Stroul and Donald Trump saying we're there for leverage and to steal their oil. they'll go with the official propaganda line, the one that they're told to say, which is this, that about 900 American troops remain in Syria chasing the remnants of the Islamic State. So they just happen to be there. We just happen to remain there, and we're just chasing around the Islamic State. We're just chasing them around.
Oh.
What's left. So that's what New York Times says, because they're not allowed to actually acknowledge the openly admitted reasons for being in Syria as articulated by people like Donald Trump and Dana Stroul.
Why are they not allowed to? By who? The finance people, like is it like Northrop Grumman or whoever pays for it, or is because why is the government able to?
Well, because Donald Trump blurts out the truth sometimes because he's a loudmouth, and that's why they don't like him. And Dana Stroul, when she made that admission we saw in 2019, she wasn't speaking to us, the public. She was speaking to a congressional hearing.
We can always take that down off the internet.
Yeah, well, and also it's not intended for the public. It's not like they don't think people like us are going to be watching these long hearings. That's for their own internal purposes as they're planning on how to pillage Syria. So they can speak the truth there. But when the public is told about why we're in Syria, this is what we have to be told. We're just there chasing the Islamic State. But I wrote an article back in September 2021 pointing out what a lie it was. Even if you put aside the question of do we have the right to be in Syria to begin with? Of course we don't. It's an illegal occupation. Syria doesn't want us there. Putting all that aside, even the official pretext that we're there to fight ISIS, it's a lie. And the reason we know that is because the Pentagon, which is in Syria, produces reports pretty often showing what they're doing in Syria. They have to explain by law basically what they're doing in Syria. So they have to produce these reports every couple of months articulating what they're doing in Syria. And they point out this, and I wrote about this in this article called "To Keep U.S. Troops in Syria, U.S. Leaders Are Lying Like in Afghanistan." And this is what I wrote. The U.S. government's claim to be occupying Syria to fight ISIS is undercut by a series of admissions concealed from a wide audience. In overlooked statements and briefings, U.S. officials have disclosed that U.S. forces are barely doing any fighting against ISIS in Syria, and for good reason. As is also quietly acknowledged, fighting ISIS is not the reason why they're there. In reality, after a decade-long, multi-billion-dollar CIA dirty war that failed to overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad, the U.S. is using its soldiers, along with crippling sanctions, to keep Syria divided, impoverished, and unable to rebuild.
You're welcome.
And this is my source. This is a report from the Pentagon Inspector General on what's called Operation Inherent Resolve, and that's the code.
We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
Name for the U.S. occupation of Syria and also the U.S. military presence in Iraq, which, by the way, is also done over the objections of the Iraqi parliament, who has called for the U.S. to leave, but we just ignored that and threatened to withhold their money if they push through with it. So we're still in Syria, we're still in Iraq. But there are these reports that have to be produced to document why we're there and what we're doing there. So this is what one of these reports pointed out. So this is a chart of the coalition airstrikes, that's the U.S. coalition, targeting ISIS in Syria from April 2020 to June 2021. And look what happened. So here you have, in 1 month, in December 2020, you have 15 airstrikes. Look what happens after that, though. January, February, March, April, May, June. It goes down to up to just 3 airstrikes a month, and in June, there's none. So in this whole period, there's almost no fighting going on by the U.S. against ISIS at all, just 2 strikes. And of course, they say that they're against ISIS, but sometimes the U.S. will bomb Syrian government forces or Syrian government allies. So who even knows if these minimal airstrikes here are even against ISIS?
My bet is that they were to help ISIS and not fighting ISIS. That'd be my bet.
And that is a safe bet given the history, which we're going to get to in a second. So, and I go on, this tracks with what U.S. officials have quietly acknowledged to reporters. In reality, Politico reports, citing a Pentagon source, no American troops have accompanied local forces on combat patrols for over a year in either Iraq or Syria. So the U.S. isn't engaging in combat with ISIS forces because they're not there to fight ISIS. They're there, as Donald Trump and Dana Stroul admitted, to take the oil. And another reason why the U.S. doesn't really care about ISIS is because John Kerry admitted back when he was Secretary of State in a private recording, he didn't know he was being taped, he admitted that the U.S. watched ISIS grow in Syria in the hopes that ISIS's growth in Syria would threaten Bashar al-Assad. And just as Dana Stroul said that the U.S. is using its military occupation of Syria as leverage against Syria, John Kerry explained how, according to U.S. strategy, ISIS was leverage too. to help overthrow a government that's not under our control.
Well, now that we know Putin doesn't like them, I think it's time to unite with them.
And so remember before how Joe Biden said that the big threat to the U.S. from al-Qaeda is in Syria, not in Afghanistan anymore? He's right. What he left out, though, was the key role of the U.S. and its allies in creating that al-Qaeda safe haven inside of Syria and letting al-Qaeda grow inside of Syria. And nobody explained this better than Joe Biden himself. The only part he leaves out here in this clip is when he says our allies helped al-Qaeda in Syria. He leaves out that the U.S. was involved in that too. So he's trying to blame our allies. U.S. was just as involved in this policy.
Probably in charge of it. None of our allies would go off-road without us letting them do something.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So here he is. And this is back, by the way, when he was vice president at this point. So this is 2015, I believe, when he says this.
What my constant cry was that our biggest problem is our allies. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I've just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world.
So during this whole period, the Obama administration was claiming we're supporting moderate rebels. And here's Joe Biden blurting out the truth that moderate rebels don't exist, that actually the moderate rebels were al-Qaeda and ISIS and their allies.
You know, I told you that guy was getting driven here one time, one of my Lyft drivers who was from Syria. He was Armenian. He explained the whole thing there to me. And he goes, no, we all liked Assad. That, the Alawite minority. Yeah. He goes, they're just the strongest tribe, and if it wasn't for him, he'd have slaughtered all the Christians. Everybody who's not an ISIS Muslim would have been killed if not for Assad. And we're like, it was amazing to hear. I never heard anybody from there tell me anything about it.
And that's who the U.S. was supporting, is people who wanted to wipe out religious minorities.
I told him he was welcome.
Yeah.
And from Big News Network, U.S. lawmakers demand Syria troop withdrawal. American forces continue to occupy the country's oil-rich northeast, where they've been accused of stealing oil and other resources. Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz has introduced a war powers resolution seeking to end U.S. military action in Syria, arguing Congress has never authorized the nearly decade-long occupation. Unveiled on Wednesday, the legislation would direct President Joe Biden to remove all U.S. forces from Syria no later than 15 days after the bill is adopted. Gaetz, the resolution sponsor, cited a recent raid in Syria which left several servicemen wounded, questioning why American troops are still in the country. Congress has never authorized the use of military force in Syria. And Gaetz went on to state that the 80-year-old Biden does not have a cognitive grasp of the Syrian conflict, pointing to an August 2021 interview with ABC News in which the president appeared to suggest there were no U.S. troops in Syria. Washington has kept around 900 soldiers there for several years, including at the time of the interview. Because war powers resolutions are privileged legislation, Congress will be forced to vote on the new measure within 18 days of its introduction. The U.S. military has been active in Syria since as early as 2014, flying countless airstrikes against select militant groups and, at times, the Syrian government. Intermittent ground deployments began the same year. Under Obama, Washington doled out hundreds of millions of dollars in weapons to an array of jihadist rebel factions seeking to overthrow Syrian President Assad, though the effort later fizzled following Russian and Iranian military intervention at the request of Damascus. And from Urdu Point, Republican congressman introduces resolution to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria. Faizan Hashemi is the writer. Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz introduced a war powers resolution calling for President Joe Biden to remove U.S. troops from Syria, his office said on Wednesday. Representative Gaetz, a member of the House Armed Services Committee, filed the war powers resolution on Tuesday following a February 17th press release from U.S. Central Command, which announced 4 U.S. service members were wounded during a partnered U.S. and Syrian Democratic Forces helicopter raid in northeastern Syria, ultimately killing a senior ISIS leader, the release stated. The House of Representatives is required to vote on war powers resolutions within 18 days, and Gates argued that the Congress, which has the sole power to declare war, has never authorized the use of military force in Syria. And from the cradle, the U.S. military occupied strategic areas of Syria under the pretext of fighting ISIS while hoping to maintain leverage against the Syrian government. Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz introduced the War Powers Resolution legislation to end the ongoing U.S. occupation of Syria's northeast, the primary energy and grain-producing region of the country. In seeking to end the U.S. military presence in Syria, Congressman Gaetz argued that U.S. law had never authorized a U.S. military intervention in the country. Introduced on Wednesday, 22 February, the legislation would require U.S. President Joe Biden to remove all U.S. forces from Syria within 15 days after the legislation is signed into law. Following a recent U.S. raid in Syria in which several U.S. soldiers were wounded, Gaetz questioned the legality and rationale for leaving troops in the country.
The whole notion of logic.
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
Congress has never authorized the use of military force in Syria. The U.S. is not currently in war with or against Syria, so why are we conducting dangerous military operations there? President Biden must remove all U.S. armed forces from Syria. America first means actually putting the people of our country first, not the interests of the military-industrial complex. Though U.S. troops accompanied by fighters from the Syrian Democratic Forces initially conquered large swaths of Syria under the pretext of fighting ISIS, the official rationale for the occupation changed once ISIS was largely defeated.
The whole notion of logic.
As the Washington Post reported in 2018, after the defeat of ISIS, the Trump administration switched course, saying the troops will stay in Syria pending an overall settlement to the Syrian war with a new mission to act as a bulwark against Iran's expanding influence. That decision put U.S. troops in overall control, perhaps indefinitely, of an area comprising nearly a third of Syria, a vast expanse of mostly desert terrain, roughly the size of Louisiana. Syria analyst Jennifer Caffarelli of the Institute for Study of War noted the importance of continuing the U.S. military occupation. She observed that whether Washington chooses to admit it or not, the U.S. now has direct influence over the vast majority of Syria's most productive oil fields, and the territorial gains of the SDF are Syrian national treasures that, when added up, amount to brute geopolitical power for the U.S. The Syrian government often accused the U.S. of stealing Syrian oil, which it needs to rebuild the country and provide the needs of the country's millions of residents currently suffering from fuel shortages. In December of last year, Syrian state media claimed that U.S. military vehicles were escorting tankers loaded with oil stolen from the Hasaka countryside and moving it across the border to be sold in Iraq. In August of last year, the Syrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs claimed that the losses incurred by the country's oil and gas sector as a result of U.S. actions amounted to $107 billion since the beginning of the Syrian crisis in 2011. And watch this space. And remember, your engagement through a like, share, and or a subscribe will continue our mission. Actually will propel our mission towards the continuation of it at warp speed. And that's to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.